So I am still actually a journalist, but the difference is that I don't make any money anymore because television pays well, but being a left-wing magazine journalist doesn't pay so well. So my books are my living. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thank you to the university. It's my first time in Bonn, although I've been many times here in the Rhineland, but never here. So I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you. It's really nice to see so many young people, old people as well, but it's great to see so many young people. You know, I know that your generation, you know, this is work time. You know, I have seen you at 11 o'clock in the evening in the library. Every day is work, every hour is work. So to come here, I hope will be challenging rather than work, and it may add something. Finally, before I start, thank you for tolerating my English. It is Northern English. I don't know what the equivalent is. I think the equivalent is probably Austrian German, Tirolish German. But you will hopefully stay with me. After 1989, the philosopher Fredric Jameson wrote, "It became easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." This reflected a harsh reality in politics, which I lived through. In the 1990s, if you tried really hard, you could imagine how capitalism might end. But you could never imagine how this working class, which existed now, could bring it about. Atomized, their fighting organizations broken by neoliberalism, their culture dissolved, their collectivity and collective culture replaced by individualism, the proletariat, by the mid-1990s, no longer looked like anything like the agent of history, as Marx had imagined them, or even as the reformist social democrats, from Bernstein to Friedrich Ebert, could imagine the working class. It was a different thing. This is hard for your generation to understand, but this was completely new. This sudden evaporation of both a project and an agent to achieve the project was a new thing in the entire history of industrial society. I was born in 1960 in a place called Lee, a coal and cotton town of 50,000 people, where everybody was a manual worker. Most people, in fact, by 1960 worked for the state. But that town, by the time I was born, had 140 years of uninterrupted labor movement history, all pointing in the direction of progress. So as soon as the voting system was democratized, they went from conservative to liberal. As soon as workers got a vote, they went from liberal to Labour, the first possible election. Earlier than that, at the first possible moment they could take part in an insurrectionary general strike, 1819, 201 years ago, they took part in it. At the first possible moment they could take part in a republican insurrection, the so-called Chartist movement of the 1840s, they took part in it. I will complete the story now, but it's because it's a sad one. On the 11th of December 2019, they voted Conservative again. They became one of the 80 working class towns which completely embraced, in their majority, conservative, racist, nativist, reactionary politics. But the roots of this were laid down then. Were laid down at this moment where those people who had been the coal miners and the cotton workers lost their agency and they lost their project. When the society I was born into had agency. If I just think about the ancestors I know, my Ancestry.com timeline on my dad's side, on my father's side, goes hat maker, hat maker, hat maker, miner, 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 economics editor of the BBC. That happened not because of me, because I am convinced that there was an economics editor of the BBC somewhere among the hat makers. It's just that they were semi-literate. So in 100 years, my family went from brutality, ritualized domestic violence, illiteracy, total poverty, hunger, to literacy, to a welfare state, to self-education. My dad could read music better than he could read English. If that's been your life experience, what happens is you believe in agency. There was not an ounce of today's fatalism in the society I grew up in. So people often think that Fredric Jameson's comment is about, it's the failure of the anti-capitalist imagination, for sure. People sometimes think it's all about the Soviet Union and the failure and collapse of the Soviet Union. The idea is, this is true because if there's no living alternative, Soviet Union, Cuba, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, then you can't imagine something beyond capitalism. I can only speak for the society I grew up in. This was not true for us. We had no illusions. Orthodox communism was tiny in British life. There were no illusions. Trotskyism was strong, but for the same reason. We had no illusions as the Soviet Union. The real proximate cause of this, the failure of the anti-capitalist imagination, was something much more prosaic. It was the failure of Mitterrand between 1981 and 1983. Mitterrand comes to power, anti-neoliberalism. He wants to maintain the state. He wants to enact social justice, and he is defeated within 2 years by the financial markets. And indeed, as he himself said, by the choice between to build Europe or to build social democracy. And if that's the choice that the strongest and most intelligent, because the French socialists are full of intellectuals, the most intelligent labor movement of its time faced and failed, that was, I think, what caused many in my generation to conclude, if Mitterrand can't just do basic social democracy, then we cannot do anti-capitalism. The objective forces are too strong, and the subjective forces, the working class, is weakened and atomized. So it became rational to silence the anti-capitalist imagination. But time is a great healer. By the turn of the century, by the turn of the millennium, things had changed. First of all, the anti-capitalist imagination had revived among young people at Seattle, at Prague, at Genoa, in the demonstrations that followed the IMF and the World Bank around the world. I only went on one of those, the Prague demonstration, where somebody, not me, managed actually to break into the IMF meeting through the fence. When I saw that happen, I kind of thought Fredric Jameson's comments have a time-limited status. The anti-capitalist imagination is back, but even better, the generation that staged these protests and the anti-nuclear and the anti-road and the anti-coal protests of the early 2000s added something very important. They knew, and it was the first generation that knew this, they knew that the fate of capitalism was now linked to the fate of the carbon economy. They fought under the slogan, "Another world is possible." And as a BBC reporter, I made it my job to cover their protests. You know, the managers of the BBC thought this was absolutely crazy. Why? Why are you even interested in this? Because I saw in it the birth of something new, not just a new critique of capitalism, but a new agency, a new set of people who wanted to change things. In the climate camps, in the tent camps, they created small, temporary utopias. And they created them online as well. It may interest you, some of you, I was one of the first people to use a now defunct and discredited social media platform, virtual reality platform, called Second Life. It's now a terrible criminal, pornographic, horrible thing, but when we started it, it had some interesting things. And the most interesting thing to me was a virtual German social democratic village where everyone wore chicken hats and drank beer. And it was literally a German social democratic utopia flying in the sky, which you could have never done before virtual reality. And so the utopian impulse was there among that new generation in a way it was not among my father's and grandfather's generation. They didn't have to read Marx to know that utopian socialism was bullshit, because they had real change and transformation. You may not know or remember, because I think in Germany you had the same thing. By the time of the great successful post-war period, when wages are rising, when the state is owning most of the economy, it became common sense in the British left that capitalism had in fact disappeared. What we were running was not actually capitalism. So utopianism returned, I think, with the protest movements, and then came the financial crisis. To avoid catastrophe, governments were obliged to rip up every explicit rule of the neoliberal system. Every implicit assumption was ripped up or negated. States intervened to prop up banks that were too big to fail, even though the theory said the market will correct itself. The growth of global trade went into reverse, even when the theory said the growth of global trade is just a natural thing that's been happening naturally without human intervention. Only by taking on an extra $57 trillion worth of debt in 10 years and printing $17 trillion worth of free money were the state and the central banks able to even stabilize the system. And as you will know if you follow it, it is even now a system whose stagnation and lack of dynamism terrifies the central bankers. After this, neoliberalism, writes my friend and colleague William Davis, who works at Goldsmiths University in Britain, neoliberalism became literally unjustified. You kept the economy on life support through central bank and state intervention, but you cannot keep an ideology on life support because the human brain demands coherence. And this is not a coherent situation. The theory no longer matches the reality. So as a result, we now have a battle over what replaces the defunct neoliberal theory. Unfortunately, it is a battle of three nostalgias. The 10 years you have lived through is effectively a battle of nostalgias. The first one is the centrist nostalgia, the globalist neoliberal nostalgia. If only we could go back to the days of Schroeder, Blair, Bill Clinton, everything would be okay. In the British Labour Party, as we discuss our electoral defeat, large parts of the right of the party still think this. Possibly in the SPD, people also still think this. The global champion of nostalgia number one, nostalgic neoliberal globalism, is of course President Macron of France. And it's a nostalgia so popular in France that every Saturday they have to unleash the CRS riot police against the working class to defend it. The next, and unfortunately strongest form of nostalgia, comes from the neoliberal nationalists. Trump, Salvini, Johnson, and the rest, Orban in Hungary. This is a new form of economic nationalism allied to nativist, and I don't know whether that word nativist exists in German or its translation. I'll discuss it. The nativist and overtly racist sentiments of a section of the working class and the lower middle class. What they want is basically, see, in the 30s, these two forces, here the Prussian Junkers and the destroyed lower middle class of Germany allied around a project of extreme state authoritarianism. Today, a section of the super rich and the super precarious middle class have allied around a mixture of nationalism and neoliberalism. And if you think about it, it's logical. Because in a place like Britain, they've gone to the maximum that they can deregulate the economy and deregulate the labour market and pump sewage into rivers. Why? Because there are multinational rules. And who imposes the multinational rules? The European Parliament and the European Commission. And if you want to pump sewage into a river, and if you want to reopen the kind of polluting chemical plant that is now banned in Europe, and if you want to make people work not for £7 an hour, but for £5 an hour, you have to remove the global multilateral rule system. That's what Brexit is. That's what they're trying to do, and effectively that's what Trump is also trying to do. So I don't know if you remember Stalin's famous slogan, socialism in one country. I call this new nostalgia Thatcherism in one country. It's neoliberalism without globalization. And it is the most dangerous of the nostalgias. In my book, Klare Lichter Zukunft, I tried to describe why a section of the elite want to do it. Because if you're a billionaire like Trump, the financial system is perfect. You throw money into it at a certain risk-reward ratio and money comes back to you. You don't have to do anything. Why would you destroy the whole system when it was so generous? And the answer is because the world is not big enough for them. It's just, there is not enough profit. The post-crisis economy is so stagnant that they need always and ever more. And so a section of the US elite, the people who never played by the rules, the casino owners, people who construct buildings with trade unions which are controlled by the mafia, called Trump Tower, people like that had a different interest. And what happened with the emergence of this right is very interesting when you study it. It was within a year of the 2008 crisis. There was a seminar held by the Cato Institute, Rethinking Right-Wing Thought. Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, right-wing libertarian, wrote one of the essays for that study, in which he concluded, because the system is now unjustified, because there is so much state intervention underpinning a neoliberal free market bonanza for the rich, freedom and democracy are no longer compatible, says the founder of PayPal. Remember what the American right means by freedom: economic freedom. Democracy gets in the way of economic freedom. Goodbye democracy. That's been theorized by the American right, by Silicon Valley, 10 years ago. So do not be surprised that the outcome of this nostalgia is what you're living through now. But there's a third nostalgia. As the left revived, whether it was Syriza in Greece in 2014-15, whether it's been the Portuguese left, the Spanish left, the British left, the left here. Actually, let's be honest, there's always been two lefts. One left which wanted to reform the multilateral global system and keep it open, and implicitly to accept there are limits to what you can do. Therefore, Mitterrand failed. Economic nationalism has to challenge the global system and disrupt it if you want to do it. And there was always an economic nationalist wing. In Syriza, it was the former communists of the KKE, some of whom joined Syriza. In Spain, it wasn't Podemos, which was a far more open and horizontal and globalist movement. It was the Izquierda Unida, the former communists. In Corbynism, it's the communist-influenced ex-communists who surrounded Jeremy Corbyn, and I would argue played a major part in the defeat we've just suffered. Left economic nationalism is, for me, the third nostalgia, from which we must break. In the history of the labour movement, it's not a new phenomenon to see the fight for something new clothed in something old. The French working class of 1848 fought the 1848 revolution using the imagery of 1789. This is what the source of Marx's famous misquote of Hegel. Everything in history happens twice. The first time as tragedy, the second as farce. That's what he was talking about. That they clothed themselves in the red cap and the Julian wreaths around their heads, but they were doing something different. So it's no surprise to see nostalgia on the left. But my argument is this: the social crisis we face is so great, and the threat to democracy and the rule of law is so urgent, and the climate crisis is so great and historic that we can't afford nostalgia anymore. We have to unite around a vision of the future. We being who? What we're facing in the new right, the alt-right, the conservative right, a perfect example of which you've seen in Austria, the total moral cowardice of mainstream conservatism faced with far-right authoritarianism. What we see there is what Hannah Arendt called the temporary alliance of the elite and the mob. Arendt's quote is very worth discussing, and in the Clara Lichter Zukunft book, I spent an whole chapter talking about this. The full quote is, she says, what Goebbels promised, this alliance of the elite and the mob, was access to history. Access to history. What that means is they want to reverse history. Arendt finishes the sentence, even at the price of destruction. These people are quite prepared to destroy. Their entire mindset is a reset button. Let it fall, let it bleed, let it collapse, and then on the ruins of democratic Western society, we will rebuild the right-wing utopia. And that's the problem. They have a utopia. So we need to urgently outline our own vision. But we can't do that on the left. And I should finish the point. Who is we? For me, the lesson of the 30s is that the only antidote to the alliance of the elite and the mob is an alliance of the center and the left. I speak as someone who spent my entire life on the left. I speak as someone who is, when I say this, criticized heavily in Britain, because what I really mean is that we are surrounded by liberal, cosmopolitan, nationalist and green parties now in Britain, that the impulse of my party is to fight against them. I want to make them our allies, because there's now a bigger fight. But in that, the left cannot lose sight of its own utopia. For me, there are three kinds of crisis underway, and I'm only really going to talk about one. But we must recognize we're in a triple crisis. The climate, by 2050, if we don't solve it, the spiral, the feedback loops will begin to really plunge human society on this planet into chaos. The crisis of neoliberalism I have described, but I want to spend the middle of this talk discussing the crisis of information technology, or more specifically, a crisis of reproduction which capitalism experiences because of the specific nature of information technology. And this, if you like, is the central bit of the post-capitalism thesis. Since Paul Romer wrote his seminal paper, Endogenous Technological Change, in 1990, we have had the theoretical basis for understanding that information machines are different to all other machines. A digital product is infinitely copyable. As a result, the cost of reproduction tends to fall over time and under market conditions towards zero. Things become so cheap that the actual cost of production is negligible. I sometimes do this on PowerPoint, but I only have the analog version, which is my hand today. You know that the cost of software, the cost of bandwidth, the cost of storage, the cost of processing power has fallen exponentially, like this, exponentially in the last 20 years. The same is true of the cost of DNA sequencing. DNA sequencing per genome used to be 100 million in 2000. It's now $1,000. It's an exponential fall. real things, not just information, the cost of real things can fall exponentially under market conditions. If you want to just understand this better, even if you don't agree with Marx's famous labor theory of value, just use it as a mental tool to just understand what's going on. It's a really useful tool for understanding what this means. Marx, unlike the marginalists, unlike Wenger and co., said that all commodities, every single thing that we have, has a usefulness and a market value, and that they are exclusive qualities. The usefulness of this, to me, this product here, is very different to its exchange value. Now, Marx said that the exchange value of everything is determined by how much labor it took to make it. I'm simplifying. How much labor time went into making the thing, says Marx. That's the value, the economic value. The usefulness is its usefulness to me. Now, what information technology allows, and what Romer, in his own non-Marxist way, discovered, is that almost no labor goes into information goods, certainly into the reproduction of them. And that is why the natural price of a music track is zero or close to zero. And that is why you have to do something you don't have to do. If you bake a loaf of bread, it has a price. Of course, if someone steals it, you call the police. But it doesn't take the policeman to create the price of the loaf of bread. With a music track, it takes a policeman called the copyright law to even create a price on the music track. That's the difference between information technology and everything else. To put it another way, as Stuart Brand, the famous kind of hippie Silicon Valley theorist, once put it, information wants to be free. To put it as Kenneth Arrow, the famous Keynesian economist in the 1960s, put it, when they discovered intellectual property, in a free market with competition, if you have intellectual property, the only purpose of intellectual property laws is to create an artificial scarcity of information. It's a new dynamic. And what are the effects of it? We're now in the kind of deep detail of the post-capitalism thesis. There are four effects of information technology, four economic effects, which affect capitalism quite profoundly. This that I've just described, the falling production cost towards zero, is called the zero marginal cost effect. It's not just my theory. Many mainstream economists recognize it. Most of Silicon Valley operate as if it is true. The second potential thing is equally huge. So what does this do? If lots of products have a natural tendency to fall in their cost of reproduction towards zero, it's very hard to create prices. It's certainly very hard to create profits based on production costs. That's the typical markup theory of profit. There's another big problem: rapid automation. We know, as the Oxford Martin School research and all of the research tends to suggest, between 1/3 and 1/2 of jobs are susceptible to automation by the middle of this century. This is different than before. Before, and capitalism's perennial survival mechanism is, yes, of course, to automate jobs, but then to create new high-skilled jobs needing human skill with high wages so that they can be replaced. That's the Fordist theory of capitalist reproduction. Eventually, the worker on the Ford production line can afford a Ford car. That's why Marx's simplistic theory that said the working class was going to get poorer never came about. It was never true, and I don't think he really, it's not so simple either there in Marx. But we have a new problem. We can quite easily automate jobs faster than new ones are created. If you thought your children would get a high-skilled job sequencing DNA when it was $100 million per genome, and now it's 1,000, do the math, they're not going to. There are still high-skilled jobs, mainly in human-to-human services, where machines can't operate. And if you read the sociology of automation, the predictive sociology, it's serious, because it's no longer the case that only cheap manual work will be automated. what is possible is that brain surgery can be automated. Certainly automobile production will be automated. Certainly there are 500,000 men, 500,000 mainly men in Britain whose job is to drive a white van and deliver for Amazon. Do not train your son or daughter to become a white van driver, because within 30 years this will be automated. That's the big problem. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is the network effect. The network effect, first discovered by the boss of Bell Telecom 100 years ago, is that the more people on the network, the more useful it is. Networks create free utility that escapes the market, that naturally escapes being captured by either the buyer or the seller. There is free stuff being produced when we interact on a network that does not naturally sit with the buyer or the seller. It's called an externality in economics, and it's huge. Fourthly, data democracy, open source. If we were to find that Paul Mason's Wikipedia entry is wrong by the end of this evening, it can be corrected on behalf of billions of people who could now read it by tomorrow. The same as if we find something wrong with an app on your phone. It will be auto-corrected by the system itself by tomorrow. Data wants to be free and open. Now, do we live in a society where prices are falling? Do we live in a society where jobs are being automated? Do we live in a society where we are garnering the benefits of networks? Do we live in a society where information is free and open and democratically available? No, we don't. Because what has happened is that spontaneously the system has produced a defense mechanism against information technology. And my frustration with economics and economic discourse is that everybody wants to talk about the crisis of neoliberalism, and because we can see it and we can touch it, but very few people, there are a few, and I am one of them, said the crisis of the economy is linked to the crisis of reproduction that is being caused by the deep effects of technology. So what's happened? In the space of 20 years, to counteract the zero marginal cost effect, massive monopolies, bigger than anything in the era of Theodore Roosevelt or Krupp or Thyssen, bigger and more influential than any of them. Do we have automation and lower work? No. What we have got is mass precarious employment. As the amount of work needed falls, the kind of employment changes. My friend and comrade David Graeber, the anthropologist, calls this the bullshit jobs phenomenon. Millions of jobs are being created that don't need to exist. If you want an example, and I would never belittle someone who does this job, but I cannot understand why Starbucks wants to employ graduates to make coffee. It's a very strange thing. You train for 3 years in anthropology or social science, and then your job is to make coffee. But that is the fundamental institutional arrangement of modern capitalism. The third thing is, in response to the network effect, which has the potential to create free utility for everybody, the creation of business models designed specifically to stop the network effect. The rent-seeking models, the so-called platform monopolies, Uber, Airbnb, WeWork, the way your supermarket captures your data, the network positivities created by the technology are all now being captured by corporations, and the way they do it is linked to the fourth thing. Instead of data democracy, we have the biggest asymmetry of information, knowledge, and power, I would argue, in modernity. It's certainly as big. The difference between you and your access to information, the government's access to information, and Mark Zuckerberg's access to information is of a feudal scale nature, possibly even of a pharaonic Egypt. You are as powerless in front of the information giants as the peasant of Egypt was in front of the pharaoh. You have no right to know what goes on inside the pyramid, and you're lucky. You could rephrase the famous Frederick Jameson quote, "It is easier to understand it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine Mark Zuckerberg telling you what Facebook's algorithm is trying to do to you." So We now have a distorted, and I will argue, a dysfunctional information capitalism. And that's not the worst news, because the worst news is the three crises. Remember, I talked about three kinds of crises. We've got the crisis of a heavily financialized capitalism, neoliberalism. We've got a crisis of the climate, which I'm not spending time on because I'm hoping we're in Germany, you all understand the planet is burning. You know, we're not talking about Midwest America here. You have a Green Party, you are Social Democrats, you understand the climate is the #1 problem. And then we have what I've just spent some time doing, the problem of info-capitalism. What does it do? It's starting to interact. So if you just take one example of the stagnation, you know, stagnation, secular stagnation, which is one of the big problems economists are worried about, isn't just a function of printing $17 trillion from the central bank so that interest rates fall to zero, and minus, there's something like 11 trillion of negative yielding debt in the world. So that's causing stagnation. What else is causing stagnation? The fact that, really, the things that you buy from Apple, Google, Amazon, Tencent, Alibaba should be cheap, but they're expensive, because monopoly pricing makes them expensive. What else could be causing stagnation? The fact that the moment you pop up with an innovative new product, a real tech product, made in a laboratory, one of these companies buys it, and then it's up to them whether it ever gets deployed. The inequality, which Piketty talks about, rising from the heavily financialized crisis, as it were, is also reinforced by the inequality of access to information. So the three things are feeding off each other. So what do we do? Let me cut to the chase. I think this is not my utopia. It's my minimum program, in a way. And I said before that there's an alliance of centre and left, of red and green. The alliance in some countries has to include the cosmopolitan left nationalist movements as well. And I'm not just thinking about Catalonia in Spain, I'm thinking about Scotland. In Scotland last month in our election went totally nationalist. And this is a cosmopolitan left party that wants to be part of the Socialist International. Now, my colour scheme is about which bits belong to which agenda. If we start from the bottom, I think that the classic left agenda has to be to definancialize. In other words, to de-weaponize finance, to take speculative finance out of the driving seat of the economy. I think that should be a no-brainer to stabilize the world. It's the Piketty agenda, it's the Varoufakis agenda, it was Labour's agenda in the last election. The circular economy, so zero waste, should be a no-brainer. The Green New Deal, to propel Western societies towards zero net carbon before 2050, if we can, should be a no-brainer. How we do it is a challenge. In Labour Party, we went some way, I'm really proud of this, that we went some way to spelling this out. Of course, these nativists in my hometown didn't like it, but we spelled out. It means we're going to have to build relentlessly wind farms, solar power, insulate homes, and those of you who thought it was a good idea to reopen a coal mine, it was a bad idea. You know, that's what we had to say to them. But the top bit is the tech bit, the technology bit. And I think these 4 points correspond to the 4 points that I showed you before, the distortions. We need to abolish the technology monopolies, either through public ownership or through breakup. European Union will always favour breakup, but it's useless. It's got useless competition regulations. Competition Commissioner is a kind of practice job for becoming a Google executive, it seems. But maybe that could change. I think in countries with sovereignty, like the United Kingdom and the United States, Japan, it's about public ownership. Taking the base layer of Facebook into public ownership, the ID registry. De-link work from wages. How? Through a universal basic income and universal basic services. Abolish rent-seeking business models, literally to say, as the Berlin Länder government said, no, we actually don't want Airbnb. Or as many cities have said, London included, Uber, you either play by the rules or you get out. If we could abolish child labor, we can abolish Uber if we want to. Or turn it into a publicly and mutually owned cooperative that is non-profit. And say thank you very much for the brilliant innovation you did of putting the driver's face on the app and making some women feel safer when they went home. That was good, but thank you. We don't need you to be making hyper profits out of that innovation. Market theory tells us that innovation will soon spread to the rest of the economy. Thank you. And finally, data is a public good. To say to these big tech monopolies, you know, in Britain right now, our National Health Service is selling the health data or giving the health data of millions of patients to Google so that Google can innovate with that data. That should not, it should happen, but at a price and with the revocability of ownership so that we own some of the innovation. These things, I think, are not a utopia, but they are a start. Where do they lead? One of the most important things I learned in the last 2 years, well, it was a kind of two-stage process. The first was the shock of reading that October 2018 IPCC report on climate, where we realized that if we carry on as we are, the feedback effects, the chaos effects will kick in after 2050. We only have 10 years to halve carbon emissions. We only have 30 years to finish net carbon completely on this planet. The second moment of realization I had was soon after that. I went to a seminar in Berlin hosted by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And Rosa Luxemburg's expert on climate is a guy called Tadjom Müller. And he convinced me of this. We on the left have kind of adopted a relaxed attitude to time. And it's true of the right of the left and the left of the left. Edward Bernstein said, you know, it's not the goal, forget the goal, it's the enjoyment of being on the way that we want to celebrate. And he was right with all those lovely, you know, nurseries and choirs and, you know, women's groups created by German social democracy were the path. And it made it, you didn't have to live to see socialism to enjoy being a social democrat. The left version of it is what Luxemburg says in her final, in the Order Reigns in Berlin, her final newspaper article. The left marches to victory through a series of defeats. Well, the problem we have, and what was that premised on? The idea that we need the proletariat to mature. It needs, the conditions need to be right, and the agent needs to be intelligent and self-confident and be ready to take power. That's the old Marxist, that's Marxism in one sentence. We are now in a post-Bernstein, post-Luxemburg world. We have 40 years maximum to do this, with some leeway, 30 years probably, 10 years to halve the carbon. It's a new way of thinking. Another example would be Martin Luther King. The arc of history, the arc of the universe, says Dr. King, is long, but it tends towards justice. No, it doesn't. Not when climate is concerned. Climate is a deadline. This must reorder all our thinking and make our, and for me, I'll finish here. Because we have so little time, we can't any longer rely on the mechanism of waiting for the conditions to mature and waiting for the consciousness of people to mature through experience. So every story of every social democrat is they start in the factory, they start in the coal mine. Aneurin Bevan was the founder of our National Health Service. He was a left social democrat who learned his leftism as a syndicalist in the coal mines. And you can, I'm reading his rereading his autobiography, and you see him go from one chapter to another, from injustice in the town, injustice in the coal mine, injustice in the world. You know, you see these workers become more and more intelligent, more self-activating, greater people. I would love that we could wait for that, but we can't. So we have one weapon that we can use to activate people, and it is vision. We need to use the power of collective imagination. I think the left has been incredibly weak at using this because we have had these two things going on in our minds. Are the conditions right? Are the masses ready? This will never be true before 2050. What can be true is that millions of people adopt a new idea. I mean, I use a controversial example of this in Clara Lichter Zukunft, which is almost calculated to annoy my Marxist friends, but it's the example of early Christianity. In the year 302, all Christians, were persecuted by the Emperor Diocletian. They refused to be persecuted. By the year 370, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. I'm not advocating martyrdom. I'm not advocating the kind of things that they did, but it is an example of a time when there was no internet, of how rapidly an idea can spread if people begin to live it. And I think this is the thing about utopian socialism. In the era of Etienne Cabet or Henri Saint-Simon or Charles Fourier, the classic utopians who Marx attacked, they didn't just dream of the utopia, they tried to create it on a small scale. And I think that's, for me, what a lot of the left's task has to be. To imagine the society with zero carbon, with zero waste, with almost very, very little necessary work, with massive automation, with products that are cheap or free as the pencil I could take from any one of your desks and walk out. If I took your pen, madam, comrade, and walked out with it, you wouldn't chase me. You wouldn't send a Bonn police department to get your pencil back. Other products can be just like that, basically held in common. And a society of collaboration where small-scale business and social enterprise models can live alongside what needs to be large-scale, which is obviously the energy system, the state itself. I think that's not only a basis for the renewal of social democracy, it is social democracy in a way. Social democracy is a word with a qualifier word. It's democracy, but social. We often forget that, especially places like Britain where there is no real social democracy. We just have Labourism, which is a different tradition. Social democracy was always a vision of a democratic society with a social angle. I think that it has to be a social climate democracy, a carbon-free social democracy is what I would advocate. And to finish, I think we are now at a point where we have to think about who the agent of change is. I love Brecht. I'm unfashionable, and I've never stopped liking Bertolt Brecht's work and studied it as profoundly as I can. I don't think his greatest work is any of the plays. I think his greatest work is the film Que le Vampe, Who Owns the World. And I know the Marxist Brecht would have finished it in one way. This is a scene, you know the film. The communist youth are coming back from a lovely away day on a horrible Berlin U-Bahn train, full of bourgeois, full of fascists. And these bourgeois and the fascists are saying to them, you won't change the world. Nothing will change. It will never change. The Marxist Brecht wanted to write, the proletariat will change the world. But the artist Brecht wrote something different. The people who are going to change the world is everybody who doesn't like it. That's who the agent of change is. That's who the new utopians need to be. Thank you.